Hello and welcome to our next lesson in this B4 topic. In previous lessons we've looked at the circulatory system, we've looked at blood vessels, the structure of the blood, we've looked at the heart, problems with the heart. Today we need to start looking at what's known as the gas exchange system. So on the board there is a picture at the moment. I would like you to pause the video and have a think about the question. Pause the video now, press play when you're ready to go over the answer. So you should have paused the video and had a think about the question on the board. What we've got here is what's known as an iron lung, and this was used in the early 1900s, okay? Now this is helping the patient as it allows them to breathe. It allows air to be pulled in and out of the patient's lungs so that they can breathe, okay? It worked essentially by changing the pressure inside of the giant chamber so that air was pushed into the lungs and then pushed back out. So the pressure would change inside this big box. Now, if you're unfortunate enough to have to go on a ventilator, you will simply have a tube put down into your lungs which will push air in and out rather than changing the pressure on your actual body. So today's title, in your books, as you would do for any other lesson, you need to write the title, please, Gas Exchange. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to identify the parts of the human gas exchange system. You should be able to explain how the process of ventilation happens, and you should be able to evaluate how the alveoli are adapted to carry out gas exchange efficiently. Okay? So, first things first, we're going to define the word ventilation, okay? Ventilation. And is it one or two to one? Ventilation. And ventilation can be defined as the movement of air, the movement of air or water into and out of a gas exchange organ. Into and out of a gas exchange organ. Now, in humans, this gas exchange organ would be the lungs. In fish, it would be the gills. That's why we say air or water. So we can add underneath here by saying, in humans, the gas exchange organ is the lungs, but in fish it's the gills. But in fish it is the gills. Okay? Now, for GCSE science, you need to be able to label all of the parts of the human gas exchange system. So, on the board at the moment is a diagram showing the parts of the lungs. Okay? So we can say, in fact, before I move on and say anything else, that gas exchange takes place in the lungs at a part known as the alveoli in humans. And we'll talk more about that in detail later. But for now, all you need to know is that the movement of air or water in and out of a gas exchange organ is known as ventilation. In humans, the gas exchange organ is the lungs, but in fish it's the gills. Gas exchange takes place in the lungs at a part known as the alveoli in humans. And as I've just said, we're going to write down for GCSE science, for GCSE science, comma, you must be able to label this diagram from memory. Okay, so for GCSE, you must be able to label the trachea, you must be able to label the lungs, you must be able to label the intercostal muscles. Essentially, what the lungs are is a series of tubes that get smaller and smaller, ending in an air sac known as the alveoli. So the first tube that air goes down from the mouth and the nose is known as the trachea. This is the widest. The trachea splits into two smaller tubes known as the bronchus. The bronchus split into even smaller tubes known as the bronchioles. And at the end of each bronchiole there is what's known as an alveoli. So when we breathe in, air enters the trachea, it enters the bronchus, it enters the bronchiole and it goes to the alveoli. When we breathe out, it goes from the alveoli to the bronchiole, to the bronchus, to the trachea and out into the atmosphere. So I'm just going to say, before we clear this screen, we can say that the lungs comprise of a series of tubes that get progressively smaller, ending in alveoli. Okay, so we need to clear the screen. You must learn these labels, okay? There's no way I can do that for you. You need to simply be able to label this diagram. One that we do need to think about for the next slide is the diaphragm, which is a sheet of muscle below your lungs, and your diaphragm, when relaxed, is pushing up. And we need to know about these intercostal muscles, which are muscles found between the ribs that contract to move them. So let's clear this first, and then let's have a think about the process of ventilation. So put the subheading, please. Process of ventilation. And underline it. And we're going to use a diagram from the PowerPoint, which you have access to, that looks like this. Okay. So if we paste our diagram in, make it a bit smaller, you will be able to see that bigger if you can't read it at the moment. So the first thing we need to write down, and this is a common misconception, the reason air moves in and out of your lungs is due to the changes in pressure inside the lungs. So we can say that ventilation takes place due to changes in pressure within the chest cavity. Within the chest cavity. Okay, so changes in pressure inside the chest cavity cause ventilation to take place. Remember, ventilation is the movement of air in and out of the lungs. Now, there are two processes to ventilation. There is what's known as inhaling, which is a posh word for saying breathing in. Breathing in. And there is another word called exhaling. Exhaling, which is a posh word for saying breathing out. Breathing out. Okay? Now you need to know about how these processes happen. Okay? So during inhalation, I'm going to divide the screen up in two in case you hadn't already noticed. And we'll put our titles there. During inhalation, which is shown here, the diaphragm contracts and flattens out. It moves down. Okay? So the diaphragm contracts, moving down. At the same time, the muscles between the ribs contract, moving the ribs out. So when you breathe in, if you put your hand on your chest, you can feel your ribs moving up and out. This is because the intercostal muscles contract, pulling the ribs up and out. So we can say intercostal muscles, contract, pulling the ribs, up and out. Now these are both shown on this diagram. So the intercostal muscles are contracting to pull the ribs up and out. The diaphragm is contracting, which pulls it downwards. These two things increase the volume of the chest cavity, decreasing internal pressure, and air rushes into the lungs. So we can say these increase the volume of the chest cavity and decrease the pressure and decrease internal pressure which allows air to move into the lungs. I don't think I'm going to have much room, but I do want to say allowing air into the lungs. Okay, so we've got the diaphragm moving down, we've got the intercostal muscles contracting, pulling the ribs up and out. This increases the volume of the chest, decreases the internal pressure, and air moves into the lungs, okay? This is what breathing in is, inhaling. On the other hand, when you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and moves up into the chest cavity. So the diaphragm relaxes, moving up into the chest cavity. At the same time, the intercostal muscles relax and they move down. They allow the ribs to move back down into the chest. So intercostal muscles relax, allowing ribs to move down and in. So the diaphragm is relaxing and moving up into the chest cavity. The ribs are moving down and into the chest cavity. This decreases the volume of the chest and increases the pressure, forcing air out. Okay, so if we just get these circled, so you know what I'm talking about on the diagram, we can say these decrease the size or the volume, even the volume of the chest cavity and increase internal pressure so air is forced out of the lungs. So air is forced out of the lungs. So ventilation takes place due to changes in pressure within the chest cavity. Inhaling, breathing in, so when we take air in, is due to our diaphragm contracting, moving downwards, our intercostal muscles contracting, pulling the ribs up and out. If this moves down and this moves out, the volume inside the chest increases. This decreases the pressure inside the lungs and air rushes in. When we exhale or breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes, pushing upwards. The intercostal muscles relax, allowing the ribs to drop down and in. This decreases the volume of the chest cavity, increasing the pressure, and air is pushed out of the lungs. So that brings us to our final learning objective. If we have a look back at these learning objectives, because we haven't revisited them for a while, you should be able to tell me the parts of the human gas exchange system. I should be able to show you this diagram and you should be able to just label it. You need to be able to tell me how ventilation actually happens, which we have just discussed here. And finally, we need to think about how the alveoli are adapted to carry out gas exchange. Now, gas exchange is something we haven't defined up until yet, and there is a reason for that. We did touch upon it in B1, so you may have a bit of an idea about what it is. So gas exchange can be defined as the swapping of gases across a surface. Now, the reason I give it this definition is because there are lots of examples of gas exchange. On my lesson notes, the definition I've got written down is the process by which the body takes in oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. This is an example of gas exchange. Fish take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. However, plants take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. So it depends on the organism. So we can just put underneath here, we can say, e.g., swapping of carbon dioxide and oxygen in a leaf. Okay, that is one example. However, in humans, so we can say in the lungs, oxygen in inhaled air is swapped for carbon dioxide in the blood. For carbon dioxide in the blood. And then we can just put comma. This is gas exchange. This is gas exchange. Okay. Now, the part where carbon dioxide and oxygen are swapped in a process called gas exchange in the lungs is known as the alveoli. So we can put the subheading, the alveoli, and underline it. And we can take the final diagram from our PowerPoint. Okay. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I can't because it doesn't matter. I was going to edit it, but I haven't got a PowerPoint subscription anymore, so I cannot do that. So the alveoli are air sacs at the end of bronchioles where gas exchange happens. So the alveoli are often referred to as air sacs at the end of bronchioles where, we'll neaten that up a bit because that's really annoying, where gas exchange happens. Okay, so the alveoli are air sacs at the end of bronchioles where gas exchange happens. Now, the gas exchange in the alveoli happens by diffusion. So we can say that gas exchange happens via diffusion. And that's a really important idea. Okay? Now, the alveoli is adapted for having quick diffusion by having a large surface area. So we can say, we'll use this blue, The alveoli has a large surface area If it has a large surface area, there can be lots of space for where diffusion can happen. It has a rich blood supply, which maintains a high concentration gradient so that diffusion always happens very quickly. It has thin walls, which reduces the diffusion distance needed for gas exchange to take place. And finally, there's lots of them, or even millions of them in each lung. Again, this increases the surface area for gas exchange to happen. So when we breathe in, we inhale, it goes down our trachea, down our bronchus, down our bronchioles, into our alveoli. The oxygen then diffuses into our blood, into our red blood cells. Okay? When we give the red blood cells oxygen, causing them to become oxygenated, the red blood cells diffusion causes carbon dioxide to move from the red blood cells into the alveoli. We then exhale. It goes from our alveoli into our bronchioles, into our bronchus, into our trachea and out our mouth. And we do that, 16, 17 times a minute. So, if we look back at our learning objectives, you should now be able to tell me the parts of the human gas exchange system. You should be able to explain how the process of ventilation happens, and you should be able to evaluate how the alveoli are adapted to carry out gas exchange efficiently. If you have any questions about today's lesson, please do not hesitate to contact me either in Google Classrooms or by email. And until the next lesson, I will see you then. Take care.